Do you want me to pause it until we actually start?
Can you do that?
Yep.
Hey, you want to make anybody wait too long, and I know other people will join us along the way. Right now it looks like we're at 8. So as Chris said, we'll have Stacy take everybody off of mute unless you mute yourself because you have a dog barking or something like that. So thank you everybody for coming today. I really appreciate this. And I would like to introduce Chris Nelson to you. He's with the PUC here in South Dakota, and he's going to talk to us today about wind energy and the changing electric generation mix. I hope you enjoy this on Zoom. We're giving it a shot this week, and so far it's been working pretty well. So thank you, Chris, for coming, and you go for it.
Hey, thank you. Just confirm, am I coming across okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I, first of all, greatly appreciate Thea asking me to do this and organizing. I was scheduled to do this in 4 different locations. And actually, when I put my notes together back in February, my very first note was to tell you all that this is the first time I've done anything like this, but certainly excited to be able to do this and to share. And I'm just playing with things just a little bit here to get organized. I do want to keep this as an informal discussion. So as we're going through this, if there's something you'd like to ask or a question or a comment, just interject. We've got a small enough group that I think we can do that without creating chaos. And obviously I'll take some questions when we get to the end. As they indicated, I am one of 3 public utilities commissioners for the state of South Dakota. My fellow commissioners, Gary Hansen and Christy Fegan, our offices are in the state capitol. We haven't been in the state capitol for about 6 weeks. Obviously, with everybody else, we're working remotely. And so the topic that they asked me to talk about was wind energy. And I've added onto that wind energy and the changing electric generation mix because those 2 topics really go together. And so the first thing I want to do is kind of explain the interaction that the Public Utilities Commission in South Dakota has with wind. And there's really 2 things or 2 areas that we intersect with. First of all, if there's any new wind project that wants to be built in South Dakota that's greater than 100 megawatts, they have to get a siting permit from the PUC. Now, what's 100 megawatts? Somewhere between 30 and 60 turbines, depending on the size of the generator. But that's anything larger than that has to get a permit from us. The second intersection that we have, the PUC has pretty heavy regulatory authority over investor-owned utilities. Those would be like Xcel and Montana Dakota, Mid-American, Northwestern, Black Hills Power, and Otter Tail. And so if any of those investor-owned utilities want to purchase wind power, part of our role is making sure that those purchases of either the project or the power itself are prudent and reasonable. And so those are the 2 intersections that the PUC has with wind energy. It's important, and I probably should have begun with this statement, that the job of the PUC is not to be for or against wind energy. We're neutral in that, but rather for those 2 places where we intersect with wind energy, our job is to evaluate the permitting based on the standards that are laid out in state law and the facts of the individual project that's come in front of us, or in the case of where an IOU is purchasing power or purchasing a project, evaluate those purchases based on the prudence of that purchase. And so that's our kind of setting the stage for my discussion. You know, in The Wizard of Oz, there is a famous line, "Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain." And for most of us, that's how we describe utility service. We don't really care what's going on behind the curtain. As long as the light comes on when we flip the switch and the furnace starts when we turn up the thermostat and something comes across on our screen when we type in a URL on the internet, we're happy. Our utilities work. Well, for the next few moments, we're going to kind of go behind that curtain and take a look at what I'm calling the electric generation revolution and the real rush towards wind energy that we're seeing in South Dakota and across the country. When I talk about the electric generation revolution, we are seeing a dramatic transition in how electricity is generated in this country. And the entire focus of what is driving that transition is all about carbon dioxide emission reduction. Everything that's being done is all focused on how do we reduce the emission of carbon dioxide as it relates to electric generation. Utilities are pushing that. Corporations that are purchasing electricity are pushing that. Individuals are pushing that. And certainly politicians are pushing that. Probably more so in other states than here, but we're seeing that. So what does South Dakota's electric generation look like? From 2018, 50% of our electricity is generated from hydroelectric power, the 4 dams on the Missouri River. 22% was wind energy, 19% coal powered, and of course we only have one coal powered station in South Dakota, and that's the Big Stone plant, and then 9% natural gas. And so that's South Dakota's mix. So 72% of our generation is carbon free already. There are only 3 states that emit less carbon dioxide than South Dakota in their electric generation. And so when we talk about green energy, South Dakota is really already there. We're doing what a lot of the rest of the country would like to be doing. So let's compare us to the rest of the country. I said South Dakota, we're 72% carbon-free generation. The United States is 36%. And so we're really twice what the rest of the country is. So this is a kind of a 5-year snapshot of electric generation in South Dakota, some historic data. And as you'll notice, the real thing that changes here from year to year is the amount of hydroelectric generation on our dams. And as that changes, then it changes how much the other sources generate. And of course, how much hydroelectric is generated is pretty much a function of how much water is there in the river. And of course, the last few years, we've had quite a bit of water in the river, and so a lot of hydro generation. You will see in this chart a lessening of coal generation, and that will continue. As I mentioned, Big Stone is our only coal-fired power plant in South Dakota. Xcel Energy has some coal-fired power plants in Minnesota. They are moving those to operate more on a part-time basis. And so as we see that lessening of coal-fired generation in South Dakota, we're also seeing an increase in natural gas. I want to take a moment to look at what I call mega trends on a larger scale than just South Dakota. And I think this will give us a better understanding of where things are going on a wider basis. The United States is broken down into areas called regional transmission organizations. And these are areas of the country where the electric generation and transmission is all operated centrally and organized centrally, and the marketing is done centrally. And so I want to focus on today, just for our statistical purposes, the area called the Southwest Power Pool Regional Transmission Organization. And you can see the portion that covers. It covers most of South Dakota. We do have a little bit of eastern South Dakota that's in what's called the MISO Transmission Organization, and a portion of the western part of South Dakota that is actually not in a transmission organization. Today, we're going to focus on this kind of the Great Plains Transmission Organization and look at some statistics. So from 2008 to 2018, this 10-year period, 2008 to 2018, in this Southwest Power Pool area, wind generation went from 1% to 24% of the generation. Natural gas went from 42% to 23%. Hydroelectric, coal, and nuclear remained steady. And so you can see in the last 10 years, we've seen this dramatic increase in the amount of wind power produced in the central part of the country. More telling than that, when This transmission organization, if someone wants to hook up a new generator or a new wind farm, they have to apply to this transmission organization for permission to hook on their new generator. And so this transmission organization tracks all of those new projects, new generators that want to connect. Right now, of every bit of new electric generation in this entire area that's proposed, 75% of it is wind power and 25% of it is solar. That's it. We're not seeing an increase in anything else. Everything that's being proposed right now is either wind or solar. So let's take a look nationally. We'll expand our view just a little bit more. In that same 2008 to 2018 timeframe, what are we seeing nationally? Well, the first thing we see is that wind and solar have increased from 1% to 8%. Okay, so that's a pretty good increase, not near as much as the central part of the country, but a pretty good increase. Hydroelectric is steady. Nuclear is steady at about 20% of our generation. But I want to make just a little bit of a point about nuclear generation. While it has been steady, we are on the edge of the closure of a lot of nuclear power plants. And so that 20% is probably going to start shrinking. Of the 105 nuclear plants in this country, 8 of those have closed in the last 6 years, including one in Nebraska. Last year, the infamous 3 Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania closed. And there are 16 more that are scheduled to be closed in the next 6 years. Compare that to the fact that we are only adding 2 new plants in Georgia. And so nuclear energy is starting to wane. Now, why is that occurring? Because certainly nuclear energy is carbon-free generation. And the reason comes down to economics. Nuclear plants, while it's a great generation source, they are struggling economically to compete against very low-cost natural gas generation and low-cost wind and solar generation. And so just from a sheer economic standpoint, nuclear power is struggling. Obviously, it's unfortunate to lose that type of carbon-free generation. Notice what has greatly expanded nationally, and that's natural gas generation from 21% up to 35%. And in 2016, for the first time ever, natural gas generation exceeded coal generation. As you can see, coal is waning, natural gas is increasing. Now, how does that change relate back to my very initial statement about all of this change is being driven by trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions? And the fact is that natural gas generation emits about half the carbon dioxide that coal generation does for the same amount of electricity. And so while we're seeing coal plants go away, we're seeing natural gas generation increase, at least in the interim time. This decrease in coal generation from 50% down to 28% in that 10-year period will only continue. In our region, Xcel Energy has announced that 2 of their coal plants that are located in Minnesota are going to close 10 years early. Otter Tail has announced that one of their coal plants in Minnesota is going to close in 2021. And Montana Dakota Utilities has announced that one of their plants in North Dakota will be closing early. And so that trend will only continue. So as we've seen, renewable energy is increasing, and so that obviously begs the question, well, how much renewable can we put on the system to generate electricity? Is there a maximum to that? And so again, I'm going to look at that Southwest Power Pool area that I showed the map of a little bit earlier. And I want to throw just a couple of statistics out. In 2019, on March 27th, almost a year ago, or a little over a year ago, March 27th, 2019, at 2:40 a.m. in the morning, in that Southwest Power Pool area, 64% of the electricity that was consumed was generated by wind power. A tremendous amount of wind generation was serving the electric load in that area. That's pretty high. A month later, on April 21st of last year, 66.5% of the load was served by wind generation. So you can see that renewable can generate a large percentage of the electricity that's needed. But lest anybody get in their mind that we can do all of this with wind generation, here's another statistic. A year ago, on January 17th, in that same Southwest Power Pool area, at 12:25 in the afternoon, only 1.3% of the electric load was generated by wind. 55% was generated by coal power. And so what do you have on that January day? You've got probably a pretty cold day with a lot of electric need and no wind. And so obviously on those kind of days, the renewable energy of wind and solar couldn't generate the electricity needed, so we have to fall back on our coal and natural gas plants. So that begs a question, and I'm going to try something here that we haven't done live, and that might make Thea a little bit nervous, but I'm going to click on an internet link that will take us to the Southwest Power Pool data grid. And if this comes up, it will show us how much generation is coming from each of those sources right now as we speak. And if you can see this right now, 31% of the electricity that's being consumed in this area is coming from wind, 24% coal, 8% hydro, 29% natural gas, and 8% nuclear. Pretty balanced throughout this region at this very moment. One other thing I want to point out on this map shows the prices for electricity in this Southwest Power Pool area right now. And so if you are a utility and you needed to buy power to serve your customers, what would you need to pay for electricity? Let's look at this area down here in the very northern panhandle of Texas. You see the purple.
Chris, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yeah.
We can't see the map, but I think if you go to share screen again, you should be able to choose it.
Oh my. Okay, and I was thinking it would. So what are you seeing?
We're still seeing the link.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I think if you just go to share screen, you should be able to select it. If you can't, just go on describing it because you're doing a great job.
Finding that share screen link.
Down at the bottom of the page, when you move your mouse down there, it pops up.
I'm not getting anything. So at the top, there's a button that says Stop Share.
Yep. There should be down at the bottom. When you move your mouse down there, there's a bar that pops up. It'll have participants, chat, and share screen. Do you see that?
No, it's just all I've got is the map, and I'm not getting any controls for Zoom on this.
Okay.
Zoom will show in two different places. It'll either show at the top or the bottom. And when it does pop up, you'll see the one that's the green one. It says share screen.
Hey, Leroy, that's perfect. It's at the top.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Leroy.
I don't know what the consistency is, but I've seen it at the top and the bottom.
Yes, got it.
Are you seeing the map?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I thank you, Thea, for interrupting.
And
So-
Leroy.
Yes. So let me go back, and this was the pie chart that I was talking about earlier that shows, and can you see the pie chart? Wonderful. That shows the
I'm
actual.
not seeing a map.
Yep. So the pie chart is off on the left side, and that's showing the actual generation as we speak. 31% of it coming from wind, and 24% coal, and then the rest natural gas. As we look at the map, and this again, as I was explaining, a map of what power would cost a utility to buy. And I want you to focus on, can you see this purple area in the panhandle of Texas?
No.
So can you see the map?
No.
I can.
Carol, what are you seeing?
You.
Oh, I'm seeing the map.
So am I.
Yeah, so am I.
I
What
can see
should
the
I
map
do?
too.
Okay, well, I'm gonna keep going. So this purple area, and if you go over to the legend, you'll notice it shows a minus number. And what that means is there is so much power being generated in this area right now that they're having to pay utilities to take the power. Instead of getting paid to generate it, they're having to pay to get rid of it. And what that is telling us is that there's probably an awful lot of wind generation happening right now where they need to pay somebody to take it. It's either that or stop their windmills, and they'd rather leave the windmills running. And so they're actually paying utilities to take that power off their hands. Okay, so I'm going to try to go back to Are you now seeing the link again?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So that was a little bit of a detour. I appreciate your patience as we went through that. Okay, so I talked about the fact that, you know, within that Southwest Power Pool area, the percentage of generation from renewable sources, wind and solar, can vary dramatically between 66% on one day or 1.3% on the next day. I want to talk about a very specific event that happened on January 29th, 2019. And this is an event, and this was in 2019, a year ago. And if you remember, that was the very, very, very cold couple of days. And on the night of January 29th in Aberdeen, that night started off at minus 27 degrees. And before that night was over, it went down to a negative 37. And what was discovered that evening is that the wind turbines in the northern plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, cannot operate below minus 22. And so when the temperature hit minus 22 here at about, looking at maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, all of a sudden those wind turbines started shutting down. And by the time we got to 2 o'clock in the morning, every wind turbine in the 3 states was shut off because they could not operate in that cold temperature. And so the reason I show this is while there are days when we can have extraordinarily large amounts of our electricity generated from wind and solar, there are times when it doesn't work at all. And this was one of those times, and my comment when I learned how this had unfolded was, thank goodness, on that particular very cold night, we had some coal generation and natural gas generation so that the electricity kept flowing through the grid and we could all stay warm. Because if we'd have been relying 100% on wind energy, we would have all gotten very cold very quickly that night. So that begs the question about intermittency of wind generation. And here's a chart showing a kind of the typical 24-hour period. And you'll notice that in a 24-hour period during the middle of the night, from like midnight until 5 in the morning, wind's share of the electric generation is fairly high. But as the day goes on, wind's share of the total generation goes down. That's for a couple of reasons. One, typically there's less wind generation that occurs during the day than occurs at night. And secondly, the amount of electricity consumption goes up during the daytime compared to the middle of the night. And so while wind does a pretty good job of covering the electric load in the middle of the night, it needs to be supplemented with something during the balance of the day. When we look at just the raw intermittency of wind generation, here's a graph of Basin Electric's Crow Lake Wind Farm for the 1 month, April of 2010, showing how much electricity was generated at any given time over that month. And so you'll notice there are times when there's a tremendous amount of generation occurring, almost 400 megawatts of generation taking place. And then you've got times when there's literally almost none being generated. And for April, this is a pretty typical graph as the wind goes up and the wind goes down. Now, obviously, when the wind is not blowing, we want to keep the electricity flowing, and that's where we rely on coal power and increasingly rely on natural gas power to fill in those gaps. One more chart to show you that talks about why that fuel diversity, having various sources of generation, is important. This again, in the Southwest Power Pool, and this was their record swing of wind generation. And this occurred this last December 11th, at this particular point, almost 18 gigawatts of electricity was being generated by wind. That's a lot of generation. 21 hours later, it was down to almost 1.5 gigawatts. As the wind fell off over the entire Great Plains area, generation obviously fell off with it, and that's when natural gas and coal power had to supplement to keep the electricity running. And so probably the one maybe editorial comment that I'll make is today we hear a lot of people talking about, well, we need to get to 100% renewable generation. And as you can tell, we're moving that direction and moving fairly rapidly. But we've also got to keep in mind there have to be some generation sources sitting in the background ready to fill in when wind and solar isn't there to do that. There are some states, Minnesota being one, where they've passed legislation, talking about being 100% carbon free by 2050. And that's an interesting goal, but even the utility companies say, we don't know physically how to get beyond 80%. We still got to figure that out. So let's go back to talking about kind of this wind energy rush that we're seeing in South Dakota. As I mentioned, the Public Utility Commission has to issue a permit for any facility that's over 100 megawatts. And for the last couple of years, I can tell you, wind energy has been the PUC's focus all day, every day. Tremendous amount of our time has been involved in wind energy. And let me give you some numbers to help you kind of understand that. In the 10 years prior to 2018, 10 years before 2018, the PUC issued 4 permits for wind energy projects, 4. In 2018 alone, we issued 3, plus a permit for a natural gas generator. In 2019, we issued 6 permits for wind projects, plus a transmission line associated. In 2020, we have already issued a permit for a 110 megawatt solar project, a permit for 1 wind farm, and just last week, we had a permit application come into us for another new wind farm located in Hyde County. Plus, there's rumors of others that are out there. And so you can see within the last couple of years, this idea of wind production in South Dakota has dramatically changed. And here's the graph that shows that. You know, for the last 10 years, we've been reasonably steady, slight increases. From 2019 to 2021, we're going to quadruple. If all of these projects build, as they've talked to us about, we'll quadruple the amount of wind energy generated in South Dakota. And as I mentioned, we've still got new wind farms that are applying every day, a new one just coming in last week. And so this is really going to change the amount of generation and the type of generation that's done in South Dakota. So where is most of this generation occurring? If you look at this map, and you'll just to orient a little bit, the city of Brookings is right down here at the bottom. City of Watertown is going to be right here. And so you can see this is an I-29 corridor going north. And this is what they call the Coteau Ridge, the Coteau Hills, where there's a tremendous wind resource. Each of these little dots is either an existing wind turbine, a tower, or one that we have permitted. And so within the next 2 years, essentially from Roberts County in the north all the way down to Brookings, there's going to be solid wind turbines across this entire area. Now, is all of this electricity that's being generated from wind going to be consumed in Watertown and Brookings? The answer is no. They've got enough generation. Most of this is going to go east. There are some new large transmission lines that have been built in the last 10 years that will take most of this power to the east. So what's driving this expansion in wind energy right now, particularly this real push? There's a couple of things. First of all, there's what's called a federal production tax credit. And that is a tax credit that wind producers can get, in other words, a reduction in their tax liability for every kilowatt hour that they generate. And it's roughly between 2 and 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour of this tax credit that they can get. And so it's a tremendous financial incentive given by the federal government, you and I, the US taxpayers, for them to build out wind projects. That tax credit expires at the end of this year. Now, I think there's some talk about a little bit of an extension. Whether that happens or not, I don't know, but it's scheduled to end. And so these companies are in a rush right now to get these projects constructed so they can still take advantage of the tax credit. Secondly, as we started out talking about, utilities are having this increasing desire for carbon-free generation, and so that's pushing a lot of this. And then third, we're seeing corporations say that they want to be powered exclusively by renewable energy. Corporations like Walmart and Google, and both those companies, Walmart and Google, have purchased shares, portions of wind farms in South Dakota, where, and one of those would be that Walmart is an interest in, is a wind farm over by Highmore. Now, is the electricity that's being generated from that wind farm in Highmore going to the Walmart in Highmore? No. Or the Walmart in Pierre? No, probably not. But it's being purchased virtually to use in Walmart stores all over the country because they have an interest in being able to say, we are 100% renewable in the electricity that we consume. So that begs the question, where does this electricity actually go? And that answer comes from physics. As electricity is generated, it literally goes to the nearest load, the nearest light bulb, the nearest fan, the nearest motor, the nearest thing that needs to consume that electricity. And so while you see all of these wind farms on the eastern part of South Dakota, might some of that electricity be consumed in that area? Yes, but there's way more being produced there, and so it will end up moving to the east to be consumed where they need the power. I've talked about, these permits that the wind farm companies need to get from the Public Utilities Commission in order to build. They can't build without a permit. And so let's talk a little bit about that process. In order to get one of those permits from the PUC, all of the criteria that they need to meet in order to get a permit is laid out in state law. Very important to understand, getting one of these permits to build a wind farm is not, does Chris or the other commissioners like the wind farm? Or do we like wind power? That has absolutely nothing to do with the question, do you get the permit? It's, does your project meet the criteria that are already laid out in state law? And those criteria revolve around, if this project is built, can the health, safety, welfare, and economy of that area be maintained with the project? 5 years ago, if we were looking at these projects, everybody loved wind energy. Today, not everybody loves wind energy. There's been a pretty dramatic shift in how people are viewing these large wind energy projects. And most of the permit applications that come in front of us have some type of opposition to them. And that's opposition, folks that become part of our proceeding so that they can tell us about why the permit shouldn't be issued. Primarily, and this is a little bit of a generalization, but primarily those opponents would be people who, and I'm just going to use an example, if you can follow my cursor, might own an acreage somewhere right in the middle of one of these projects. So they might have 5 acres or 15 acres and they've got their house and that's their dwelling. They don't have enough acres where they're ever going to get a wind tower to actually be paid for the wind energy that's being produced there. But they're in the middle of the project, and so they've got to deal with the site of the towers, the noise of the towers, concerns about the shadow flicker that comes from the towers. We've heard concerns, people concerned about health impacts from the wind towers, concerns about impact on wildlife, concerns about impact on property values if a wind farm is built in those areas. And so those are some of the things that we hear from people that are opposed to building these projects in their areas. Now, the developers on the other hand that are wanting to build the projects, I mean, they talk about the positives of the wind farm. The fact that the landowners who are hosting the turbines will get payments on an annual basis from the owner of the wind farm, driving dollars into that local economy. The fact that they pay taxes to the local jurisdictions, so the counties, townships, and to a little bit of an extent the school districts get some tax payment. The fact there'll be some jobs generated, and then obviously the fact that this is carbon-free green energy. And so those are the kind of the competing interests that we have to deal with as we work through one of these permits. Typically, in the permits that we have issued, not only will we issue the permit, but we will put on that permit some conditions. In other words, if you build the project, here are some things that you have to comply with to help make this project workable in the local area. And those are things like a limit on the amount of noise that can be emitted from the wind turbine, a limit on the amount of shadow flicker that can be imposed upon the residences, requiring decommissioning plans and escrow accounts so that when the wind farm is done, the towers will actually come down and the land being reclaimed. and just flat reclamation after the construction of the project. And so those are some of the kinds of things that when we issue a permit, we say these are additional conditions that you have to comply with. Let's shift a little bit, and we're getting close to the end here. Look at, I want to talk just a little bit about where wind is in South Dakota. And this is a map that shows where is it, we think it's windy all over in South Dakota. Well, not really. There are windier areas than others, and these red spots are the windiest areas, and kind of the dark purple would be the next windiest areas. And so if you look at that Coteau Ridge, again, to the northeast of Watertown, very windy area in South Dakota, and hence a lot of the wind turbines are being located there. So let's take a look at a couple of shots of wind turbines actually being constructed. Once they decide, where is a tower going to be placed, they dig a hole, and then they lay a mat of concrete that they call kind of their working mat. And basically, it's just going to be a very solid foundation for them to begin working on building the tower. Then obviously with any concrete project, you need rebar. And with these, they use lots and lots and lots of rebar. There's a little wider shot as the rebar has been completed and they're getting ready to pour the concrete foundation for the turbine. There's the concrete being formed, poured, and as you'll see on the next, most of that is underground. And so most of that is never seen once it's covered up. All that's seen is the area where the turbine itself attaches to the concrete. And so this would be a very typical picture at the bottom of one of the turbines, the tower, the entryway door so that the workers can go in there and then either climb stairs, or some of these have elevators in them to get to the top to work on the generator and the gearbox. And then next to the turbine is going to be a transformer, and that's going to transform the energy up to 34,500 volts, and the energy then will go in underground lines to a central collection point, a substation, where the energy then will be stepped up to an even higher voltage and jump on one of the large electric transmission lines. There's a picture of the large cranes that come in to actually put the wind turbine pieces together. Typically, those towers are 3 parts. They'll bolt those together, and then obviously at the top will be the electric generator with the blades. These have gotten larger and larger over the years. A wind farm that we permitted 10 years ago, the generator size was 1.5 megawatts. Today, most of the turbines are going to be maybe a 3 megawatt or even 4 megawatt generator. So much larger generators and taller towers, longer blades, all with the idea of capturing more electricity from the same amount of wind. Here's another picture that I wanted to throw in here. When we work through these permits, one of the things we hear a lot about is impacts on wildlife. And to some extent, that's still debatable. The reason I took this picture, if you'll notice on the fence post, there's a bald eagle sitting on that fence post, and it's exactly a quarter mile from that bald eagle to the nearest wind turbine. And so obviously that bald eagle on that particular day wasn't too concerned about the wind turbine. He or she were making himself at home right amongst the wind turbines. I want to just make a couple of final comments. I've spent most of today, and this was the topic of today, talking about wind energy and this dramatic rush that we're seeing to develop more wind energy right now. That's going to slow down at some point, and new generation is going to shift to solar. We're seeing that in other parts of the country. We're going to start to see that in South Dakota. I mentioned we issued a permit for our very first large solar project earlier this year, a project down in Ogallala, Lakota County. South Dakota is probably on the trailing edge of solar development. And one of the reasons, when you look at this map, and this shows how intense is the solar resource, well, down in the southwest part of the country, you've got a lot of solar resource, a lot of sun. Up in the northern part, not so much. And so you're going to see a lot of solar development down in that southwest. But notice the gradient across South Dakota from southwest to northeast. And that's why the first permit that we issued for a project, Ogallala, Lakota County, where is that? Southwest corner of South Dakota. We're dealing with another solar issue right now in Fall River County. Again, southwest part of the state. Not that you can't put a solar farm in the northeast corner, you can, but you're not going to generate as much electricity from it. And so in order to make it as economical as possible, at least in South Dakota, I think most of the solar is going to go into the southwest corner. I'm not going to spend any more time on that other than to tell you that I really see a shift coming once we get beyond this rush of wind, more towards solar. Last comment that I want to make before we open up for questions is just to simply talk about electricity demand. The demand for electricity nationally has been absolutely flat since 2008. And we are not consuming more and more electricity. It's been absolutely flat. And a lot of that has to do with energy efficiency mechanisms. A lot of us have switched out the traditional light bulbs and put in the CFLs or LED light bulbs that consume less electricity. We buy a new furnace or a new hot water heater or a new appliance. They're more efficient than the old ones. And so that's all helped to keep a lid on electricity consumption. Now, what's happened in the last month as a lot of us have been staying home to work? A lot of the commercial locations have had to close down or restrict their hours. Nationally, and I just got this statistic this morning, in the first 28 days of April, nationally, electricity consumption was down 5% over what it was a year ago. It was 7 to 10% lower on the East Coast. Okay, so that the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic area, much more harder hit with electricity reductions than the rest of the country. And interestingly, Florida and Texas actually increased their electric consumption. And so, and that was something nobody saw, obviously nobody saw coming, but that's a shift that the electric utilities are dealing with. In South Dakota, since 2007, we've actually seen a 1.8% increase per year. And so we've got a steady increase in consumption here. I don't have numbers for what's happened in the last month. Our utilities tell us the consumption has been down. I don't have the numbers to actually quantify that. Our consumption in 2018 actually went up 3.4%. And I think a lot of that was simply the robust economy in South Dakota up to 6 weeks ago that was causing that year-to-year increase in electricity consumption. I think I am going to stop there. I have covered the waterfront. I've gone through kind of the trends that we're seeing in electric generation, spent some time talking about wind in particular and electricity consumption. And at this point, I'd open it up for any questions you've got or commentary that you might have. And I'll tell you, if we'd have been doing this in person, we'd have been doing this commentary. It would have been a discussion format much more so than this has been, because that's how I like to do things. But let's open it up and have a discussion.
Stacy, can you unmute everyone? I can't see everybody today, so go ahead and just speak up if you have a question.
Yeah, I think I can only unmute the people that I've muted, which is nobody.
Okay.
Except one, I guess.
There you go.
Chris,
I see people popping in.
Chris, I have a question.
Yes.
What is the cost per meg of building a wind tower now?
So the cost is about $3.5 million per megawatt.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What do you
Yeah,
mean by that exactly?
So let me, maybe this will help understand, make it a little bit more real. For each of these large wind farms, and well, I'm going to go back here. Okay, so where you see this map and you'll see the color changes between these areas, each of those color differences is a different wind farm. Okay? The typical wind farm is going to cost somewhere between $300 and $450 million. Each one of these clusters. And so you can tell it's a tremendous amount of capital injection into the prairie of South Dakota.
Chris, question about the Crow Lake Wind Farm area that we both know quite a bit about. The transmission line, is that the transmission line from the Big Bend Dam? Is that what they're using?
It is, yeah. It goes from Fort Thompson to, and frankly, I don't know where it terminates going east, but yeah, they've hooked into that line just north of Crow Lake, or north and east of Crow Lake.
Is there an expansion plan for that, for the capacity on that line anywhere in the future?
So there's really kind of two questions. First, is there any more capacity available on that line? I don't know the answer to that question. And is there any plan to expand the wind farm? Not that I'm aware of. Here's the thing that we are starting to see with some of the older wind farms. And the one in South Dakota that this has already occurred in, and Jim, you're aware of this one, the Wessington Springs Wind Farm. That's the one to the southeast of Wessington Springs. The smaller farm, I think there's maybe 30 turbines there. They have gone through what's called a repowering, where they've kind of refurbished the generator and put on longer blades. And the idea is, with those longer blades, they can capture, or they can generate electricity more efficiently at some of the lower wind speeds. It's all about how much can you grab out of the wind that's there, and with these longer blades and more efficient electronics and all of that. And so we saw that repowering occur on that Wessington Springs wind farm. And I suspect as some of these other wind farms get some age on them, we'll see some more of that if there's the capacity on the transmission line to take the additional power.
With the variability of wind production, there's been a lot of talk about battery storage and things like that. Do you know what kind of timeline or likelihood that something like that will be developed in the next 20 to 30 years?
David, that's a great question. And I will tell you, typically when I'm talking to classes, I am talking to high school or college students, okay? And I will tell you all the same thing I tell them. And this gets their eyes about this big. I tell them, if you can develop economic battery storage, economic electric storage, you will be a billionaire by tomorrow, okay? And I like that idea. Maybe we'll spark somebody. And that really is the holy grail of all of this, is figuring out an economic way of storing this electricity so that when we've got those days of massive wind generation. Think about the map where I showed the panhandle of Texas, where right now they're having to pay somebody to take their electricity because there's too much of it. Well, if they could store it and sell it later when there's actually a market for it, that starts to make sense, and that will make this renewable generation a whole lot more workable. So where are we at? There are utilities that are installing huge batteries today. They're very expensive, and for the most part, I think a lot of them are putting them in to kind of get their feet wet with the idea of storing. There are some other storage mechanisms, like something called pumped hydro, where you have two reservoirs, one above the other, and when electricity is expensive, the water runs downhill and generates electricity. When it's cheap, they pump that same water back uphill, and get ready for when electricity is expensive again, and then water goes downhill and regenerates. And so there are some various types of generation. None of them are completely economic yet, but folks are working on it.
Chris, what are some of the facts about the side effects? The wind killing the birds, the noise, the shadow. Is there any health data on any of that?
Okay, so Carol just asked a question that we could spend the next probably 3 hours talking about, and I'll try to summarize that. So let's talk about wildlife first. So when we work through one of these permits, the developer has to go through very extensive wildlife surveys. I mean, they hire professional biologists to go out and survey what is the wildlife that's out there, what's the bird population, the avian population, paying particular attention to any species that might be endangered, to bats, and to whooping cranes, those type of things. And so we have to review all of those reports and make sure that the locations are appropriate for the type of wildlife that's there. Let's talk about whooping cranes. That's one where in some of our permits, we've added a condition saying during whooping crane migration season, you have to have people that are out looking for whooping cranes and a protocol to shut those towers down immediately if you see a crane within 2 miles of the towers. And so we take those kinds of things into account. We've had opponents that have said, well, it's going to scare all the pheasants and deer away. Well, I can tell you I've hunted pheasants and deer right in the middle of wind farms, and it doesn't scare pheasants and deer away. Health effects. There are folks that believe that the wind towers emit, well, they do emit something called infrasound, which is a sound level that humans can't audibly detect. There are folks that believe that that infrasound may be harmful to individuals. There are scientific studies, and we've had scientific experts testify in our proceedings that no, it is not harmful. And thus far, we have not found it to be harmful. Noise. Noise has been shown to be more of an aggravation than a health issue. Now, obviously, if it's high enough, it could be a health issue, but the noise level that someone might experience at their home is more of an aggravation. We put limits on that, and so they have to space these turbines far enough away from homes to try to keep a reasonable limit on that noise. Now, I use the word reasonable. That has a different definition to everybody. If you're an opponent, a reasonable level is very low. If you're the developer, a reasonable level is very high. We try to use science to find the right answer for that as we go through these permits. And so those are some of the things and concerns that we hear. We have not, to date, denied any wind farm permit. I take that back. We did deny one. They came back and refiled with a different format. And so we've permitted everyone that's come in front of us. But as I mentioned, we put many, many conditions on those to make sure that once they're built, they're compatible with folks living in that area. Other questions?
Chris, who controls whether or not the turbine is turned on?
Couple of answers to that. Basically, wind turbines are going to be on whenever the wind is blowing. The only time they're going to turn them off is obviously if they need to do maintenance on them, or if there is simply too much electricity on the grid and nobody to take it, and they have to shut it down, or what they call curtail it. Or you see whooping cranes coming, you know, that type of thing, they'll shut them down. But for the most part, these wind generators will run before any other type of generation. And so if the wind's blowing, they're going to be running. Now, who actually turns the switch? There are control rooms. Jim Fry mentioned the Crow Lake Wind Farm that he and I are pretty familiar with. My ranch is kind of in that area. That's owned by Basin Electric. Their headquarters is in North Dakota. I was in their control room, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago in Bismarck. And on their computer, I could watch as they are monitoring the wind towers turning at White Lake, South Dakota, and they could turn them on and off with the click of a mouse button from Bismarck. And so that's kind of the technical answer to who can turn them on and off.
I have a comment to share with everybody.
Sure.
If anyone is interested in more wind turbine information, my son happens to work for Gold Wind, and they have a series of YouTube videos out there that describe the basics of their company and their usage of the wind turbines. And they're just little short videos that explain things. And there's a high level of variation between the sophistication of the different companies. There are some that have literal sensors at multiple places in the site and complex operations for working with those. It's really rather fascinating. And I want to say thank you for your presentation. It's a great presentation, great maps, great slides, well organized. I really appreciate you being able to share with all the locations at once rather than 4 different times. Thank you.
You are welcome. I love doing things in person, and so I was actually looking forward to doing it in the 4 different locations. You know, Thea lined me up to do Pier, and then I get this email, oh, by the way, would you have any interest in doing other locations? And I said, you know what, you've hit my sweet spot. I love doing this, and so I'd absolutely be able to if it worked into my schedule, and it did. But you know, given where everything else is at, certainly happy to be able to do it here.
Good job. Happy to see you again, Chris.
Good to see you, Bob Miller.
Thanks, Chris, from Jim Fry. Good job. Appreciated it.
Thank
Great
you.
info.
Appreciate it. Anything else?
All right. Well, everyone, thank you again. Go ahead.
I do have one thing I wanted to ask. They were talking about when these are taken down, there seems to be some problem with what do we do with these huge blades and that sort of thing in terms of recycling or whatever. Is there any discussion being done about that?
Lots of discussion and not any perfect answers. I mean, right now, when they're doing this repowering I talked about, where they take the blades off and put bigger blades on, they're cutting those blades up and they're going into landfills, which is really unfortunate. There is a company in Texas that has begun working on a recycling product where, because these blades are mostly fiberglass, and so you know there's got to be a way to reuse that, whether it's in concrete or some other mechanism. And so there's companies that are working on it, but in the interim, unfortunately, the blades are going into landfills. Now, when the wind farms themselves ultimately come down and we decommission the entire wind farm, and that'll be when they're 30 to 40 years old. Most of what's there can be recycled. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of copper and steel that will all be recycled. We require the concrete to be taken down to 4 feet below grade. And so, you know, obviously that concrete will be blown out of there and probably reused in some fashion, you know, and so most of that will be taken care of. And my hope is 30 or 40 years from now, I'm pretty certain they'll have figured out how to recycle the blades too.
Good.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? All right.
Fascinating.
I know, really interesting. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate this. And I'm not going to let you off the hook. I'll be asking you again to help us out.
Absolutely.
That was fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.